Okay, so we'll start. So today's daf is Ayin Hey, and we're going to start Ayin Dalid Amud Bet, where we left off yesterday at the very bottom of the page, second to last line on Ayin Dalid Amud Bet. HaKorea al Manat Litfor. We are still elucidating the very, very famous and very fundamental Mishnah that was learned in the daf on Shabbat, which is the list of the 39 melachot. So we're proceeding through that Mishnah to explain each one of the melachot, its source, and some of the parameters. So we're up to Korei al Manat Litfor, somebody who tears in order to re-sow. Now we know that must be what it means, that Korea by itself could not be a melacha because it's not constructive, it's destructive. So it has to be Korea al Manat Litfor, that you are tearing in order to repair something, which sometimes you have to do. So the Gemara asks, so where do you get, in other words, all melachot, in order to be an av melacha, has to be something that you find in the Mishkan. Where were they tearing in order to re-sow in the Mishkan? Rabba and Rabbi Zera damrei tarvayu. Rabba and Rabbi Zera both said that return to Ayin Hay. Sheken yuriah shenafal ba darna. Because if they had a curtain, for instance, that had a worm that ate some holes in the curtain, and they wanted to sew it, if they were to just sew it as is, so what will end up happening is that there'll be bumps and it'll get crinkled up as a result. So what they would do is they would tear it and re-sew a whole section so that it would look smoother than making little repairs here and there throughout the curtain. So that was where you would find in the preparation of the curtains of the Mishkan a precedent for tearing being a constructive activity and therefore being a separate melacha. Amar Rav Zutra bar Tufya. So in other words, if a person were to tear an item and then re-sew, he's chayav two times, one for the tearing and one for the sewing. So Amar Rav Zutra bar Tovia, Rav Zutra bar Tovia said, Amar Rav, in the name of Rav, he tells us three halachot here. These halachot have nothing really to do with one another, but they were three things that Rav said. Perhaps he said them at the same time, and therefore Rav Zutra is telling them to us together. So the first one is relevant to our subject, which is if you tighten chut shel tefirah. So you have a loose thread in a garment on Shabbat, or let's say your button is loose and you tighten it back onto your shirt. So there's something loose in your clothing, and what it means by chut shel tefirah is a string that connects one piece of fabric to another. Okay, so you tighten it because it's coming apart. Let's say the seam is coming apart, stitch is coming apart, so you pull it tight. So in that case, that's actually chayav chatat. That is considered a malachav tefirah of sewing. Even though you're not sewing something anew, but since it was falling apart and you now repaired it, that's also a malacha of tefirah to retighten it. And then and we'll see what this means in a second. If you learn even one thing from a magosh, you are chayav mita, you are liable to death. And if you know how to calculate the tikufot and mazalot, is talking about the constellations and the seasons. In other words, you know about astronomy and you know about how to calculate the appearance of the various constellations and the motions of the planets and so on, and you don't do it, asur l'saper himenu, you're not allowed to talk to such a person. A person who has the capability he knows astronomy and he's able to study it and to make predictions and to calculate, and he doesn't involve himself in this area of study, you're not allowed to talk to him.
Is this a new idea, or is it still talking about...
These two other ideas are unrelated.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the first idea is about sewing. The second idea is you're not allowed to learn something from a magosh. That we're going to learn what that is in a second.
Okay.
And then the third one is that if a person's in a position to study the works of Hashem and the mazalot and the heavens and astronomy and so on, that he should study it. And if he doesn't, you shouldn't talk to him. In other words, it's considered that he's no good. He's a bad influence. He's a bad seed.
He had the opportunity to do it and didn't do it? Is that what you said?
Yeah, it means he has the capability of doing it, but he doesn't pursue it. So it's a negative. So and the Rambam, of course, talks about this a lot in the Sefer Hamadah. But About what?
He means just studying science.
Yeah, he's talking about studying astronomy, which to them was, the science, the most...
Well, the Mazalas was all, the business of Avodah Zarah was all hooked up with that too.
Right, but he's definitely not talking about that. In a second we're going to see.
Okay.
In a second they're going to explain each one of these statements, except for the Chut Shel Tefirah. That one's obvious. The idea of Chut Shel Tefirah, that you can't tighten a stitch. We've got that already. So now Magoshta, what is this Magosh that you're not allowed to learn from? So Rav Ushmuel, there's an argument between Rav and Shmuel what it means. Chad Amar Harshe, one says it means a sorcerer. So if Harry Potter comes, you can't learn anything from him. That's what it means. Or V'chad Amar Gidufei, one says it means a heretic. Or as Rashi says, min, a heretic ha'aduk ba'avodah zarah, who is dedicated, devoted to idolatry, u'megadef tamid Hashem, and he blasphemes Hashem, u'mesit anashim la'avodah zarah. That's what Rashi says, and he's a person who entices people to idolatry. So you don't want to learn anything from him, because you start learning from him one thing, and then he's going to suck you in to his idolatry. So is it a sorcerer or is it a heretical idolater? So now the Gemara says, Tistayim. So apparently this was an ongoing machloka between Rav and Shmuel. Whenever it appears in the Talmud, this word Magosha or Magoshta or Magosh, what is it referring to? So the Gemara says, Tistayim de Rav Damar Gidufat. We can conclude that it's Rav who must say that a Magosh is a heretic, not a sorcerer. The Amar Rav Zutra bar Tovia Amar Rav, because Rav Zutra bar Tovia said that Rav said, as we just learned, that one is not allowed to learn anything from a Magosh. And that was Rav speaking. That was being said in the name of Rav. Now, if you're going to tell me that what is a Magosh, it's a sorcerer, we have a halakha that you're not allowed to learn the ways of the idolaters. You're not allowed to learn the various kind of magical practices. When it talks about me'onen, mechashef, and all of these various occult practices that were in vogue. So you're not allowed to learn them. Lo tilmad la'asot, you're not allowed to learn to do them. That's what the pasuk says. But we learn that you're allowed to study them in order to know them. Lahavinu lahorot, because if somebody comes to you and asks, and I get questions like this all the time, you'd be surprised. People will come and say, is this practice that Buddhists do idolatry? Or is this practice that that certain Asian cultures do? Is it idolatry? Am I allowed to? So you have to know. You have to study some of the practices of other cultures to be familiar enough with them that you can say whether certain things are idolatry or not. Or if you don't know, you have to research it, because how can you make a psak? How can you give hora'ah in these subjects if you're not familiar with what actually the practice is?
If an idolatrous culture does something that is considered, like they say, that, they blink 3 times every time they pass a certain thing.
Right.
If you do that, that's considered idolatrous.
It could be. It's a very complicated area. It depends on why, and there are different opinions about under what circumstances it's prohibited. So that's like a whole big thing. But the basic idea here is that if you're going to tell me that it's asur to be a mechashef, to be a sorcerer, so I have to know what are really the actions that these sorcerers are practicing that I'm not allowed to do. So that means I have to study their system, because if I don't know what actually the practices are, how am I going to know what's forbidden?
Unless you stay away from everything having to do with it, period.
But that's almost not practical, because it might not be practical to do that, because then you're going to look at a sorcerer and everything he does you're not going to be able to do. So you have to be able to differentiate between what is really idolatrous or what is really so for instance, like when it comes to chukot akum, which is a totally different area, but like let's say the idea that you're not allowed to imitate the ways of the idolaters, right? So what about a doctor wearing a white coat? So this was a real she'elah that was asked. I mean, because it's just a chok. Why does the doctor wear a white coat? Have a blue coat. Why do doctors wear white? So the answer was that since it's done for a practical reason, which is that you can identify a doctor if you're in a hospital, so it's not considered a chok. So you have to know kind of what the parameters are. Or some people argue that like the cap and gown at graduation really shouldn't be used, because it's really something that went back to the church. So there's a lot, knowing what the source of these things is and all that. It's a machloket, actually. There was a big machloket.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So there are people who hold that you can't.
Rav Zalman Auerbach wrote in his book, Aliful Sholom, that he studied carefully yoga.
Yoga,
It was complete avodah zarah.
Really?
Really?
Really? Well, I know in India. Yeah, see, I know in India the Jews do not do yoga. They consider it avodah zarah. in India. Yeah. But here in America, it's like totally secular, and the people who are practicing it are not even anything. They're totally secular. So I don't know. So I was talking to somebody, and they were telling me in India, like it really has a religious meaning. Here, it's just some kind of a meditative, health thing. But it's
actually there are some yoga practices here that have absolutely no meditative. It's just movement.
See, I don't know anything about yoga.
It's just certain movements.
I know about yoga.
Right.
I know about yogurt. I don't know about yoga. Okay. So anyway,
that's the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so he says that clearly Rav could not be prohibiting you from learning from a sorcerer, because why? Because he himself says that. Because we know as a matter of principle, because Rav is saying you can't learn anything. In other words, Rav and Shmuel have a general machloket. What is a magosh? Rav is the one that said you can't learn even one thing from a magosh. So now the Gemara is saying we can infer from this that Rav must be the one that says that the magosh is a heretic. Because if Rav meant that the magosh was a sorcerer, then he wouldn't be able to say you can't learn anything from the sorcerer. You actually have to learn from the sorcerer because you have to know what his practices are so you know what's prohibited and you know what's permitted. So therefore Rav must have been the one that held, Rav must have been the one that held that it's a heretic you can't learn from, because the heretic doesn't have anything to teach you at all. What does the heretic have to teach you? Nothing.
And the sorcerer is a form of heretic.
Not necessarily.
He's going against the Torah.
That's true. That's true.
Because why is it necessary to know why is it necessary to learn the okay things from a sorcerer? Why bother?
Well, let's say a person did one of these actions and you want to know whether they're deserving of punishment by the Bet Din. You have to know. If it says you can't be a mechashef, and you see a guy, he went and he waved a magic wand. So now I go to a real sorcerer and I say, is that real? He's like, no, that's just fake magic. That's not a real thing. That's. So then I'm not going to give that. Now I'm not going to punish that guy.
Everyone should be doing.
Right? No. Only the chachamim. That's what it says. Lahavino laharot. They have to know. Otherwise the punishment will be let loose on everybody. So now, Tistayim, that we can conclude. So Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. So Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi said that Rabbi Shimon ben Levi said, Mishum bar kapara, in the name of bar kapara, kol hayodea lechashiv betkufot u'mazalot ve'no choshev. If a person knows how to calculate the seasons and the constellations, and he doesn't calculate them, alav katuv omer, about him, the pasuk says, V'et po'al Hashem lo yabitu, u'masei yadav lo ra'u. This is from Yeshayahu. The work, the handiwork of Hashem, they don't gaze on. In other words, they don't look at it, they don't behold it. U'masei yadav lo ra'u, and they don't see the work of His hands. So in other words, what it's saying is you have this beautiful masterpiece that God created all around you, and you don't look at it, and you don't pay attention to it. And so it's a lack of love for Hashem. It's a lack of avat Hashem. A person sees this grand universe around him, and he's not interested in studying it and appreciating it. That's a defect.
Which means today everybody's obligated to that.
It's accessible to everyone. A person should do it. And the Rambam says that's a great mitzvah to do it, to appreciate that. So Amar Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said that Rabbi Yochanan said, how do we know that it's actually a mitzvah to be involved in understanding the constellations and the seasons and so on? It says you should guard and you should do the mitzvot. Because it is your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the people. What type of wisdom and understanding is seen by the eyes of the people? In other words, the nations of the world, if you learn Hilchot Muktzeh, they're not going to say, wow, you're a great genius. I mean, they don't know what the value is. You learn Hilchot Shabbat, they're not going to know what the value is. But Kufot and Mazalot, that when you know the science, when you know astronomy, and you're able to predict the seasons, and you're able to predict things about the world, and they see the impact of your knowledge, then they say, wow, physical impact. So then they say, wow, these Jews really know something. They study God's creation, and they're able to make predictions that are correct and accurate and helpful, and therefore they admire and venerate the Jewish people. So now we go to the next melacha that was mentioned in the Mishnah, which was catching a deer. Now obviously that doesn't mean it has to be a deer, it means catching any animal. Trapping. If you catch the chilazon, which is this creature from which they used to extract the techelet dye, so if you catch this sea creature on Shabbat and you squeeze it to extract the blood, that's only one melacha. It's interesting, so we'll see why. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Chayav Shtayim. Rabbi Yehuda says actually you're chayav shtayim. You've done 2 melachot. You caught it and then you squeezed it. It doesn't mean squeezing it. It means squeezing out blood. It's not just talking about squeezing it, like cuddling with it. Shaya Rabbi Yehuda Omer Pitzia B'chlal Disha, because Rabbi Yehuda said that Pitzia B'chlal Disha, that Pitzia, squeezing the blood out of a creature, is like Disha, is like extracting. Disha Dash, the Melacha of Dash, is extracting something that is encased in or absorbed in something else. For example, if you squeeze out the juice from grapes, that is Dash. Okay, so too, if you squeeze out the blood from this creature, it's dash. It's the same thing Rabbi Yehuda says. So therefore, if you catch it and then you squeeze it, you've got 2 melachot. And Amrulo, they said to him, "En pitzia b'chlal disha." And the rabbis responded and said, "No, you're wrong. Pitzia, squeezing out blood, is not disha. It's not the same thing." Amar Rava says, "Ma'ita amad Rabbanan." What is the reasoning of the rabbis? It does seem analogous, actually. When you squeeze blood out of a creature, you squeeze juice out of a fruit. It seems like the same thing. They said, that the rabbis say that in disha l'gdulei karka, that there is no disha, that the concept of disha only applies to things that grow from the ground. When we say dash, when we talk about extracting, we're talking about extracting from plants that grow in the ground. Now the Rambam and some other Rishonim extend the idea of gidulei karka to, because there's a problem with this idea. The problem is that milking a cow is considered disha. How is a cow gidulei karka? So the Rambam explains actually that a cow is considered to grow from the ground because it eats grass from the ground. Whereas a fish that lives in the sea, it doesn't eat grass from the ground, So therefore, it's not considered gidulei karka. So that now there are other texts of the Gemara that don't have the words gidulei karka, and there's another girsa that reads it differently and doesn't have these words, and it's a little bit easier to fit with the case of the cows. But the point is that even if we do have the words gidulei karka here, it's a broader category than it would seem on the surface. And really, we're talking about a category that doesn't include sea creatures, but might include a lot more than that.
I asked you a question. Since it brought down Disha and Seder in the same thing here,
right?
So Seder is only Shadarko Latsut. Like a fly is not called Seder D'Oraisa because if you trap it, it's not.
Because you don't normally trap it.
So what about Dishas? It's only also things that are darko like.
Well, any malacha is normally only it's there.
Like an insect, you squeeze out the juice, so it's not really there.
Yeah, probably not because it has to be something which is normal. I mean, that's true in general in Shabbat laws. That it has to be something which is done in a normal fashion. That is definitely true. And so. Okay, so what the Gemara says is that the Chachamim don't apply the category of disha to this unusual circumstance. So what about the fact that when you squeeze this chilazon, you're killing it? Right, so what about the killing? So why is it only 2 things? Okay, or even according to Rabbi Yehuda, that should be 3 things because he's also killing the chilazon. And according to the Chachamim, even if they're going to say that it's not considered disha because disha is only with certain types of categories of things like fruits and perhaps extracting milk, but not extracting blood from a creature. So what about killing the animal? Why is killing the chilazon not a separate melacha here? And so the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Shepitz Omet. It must be talking about where this happened in 2 stages. You caught the chilazon, it died, and then you squeezed out the blood. So it's 2 different stages. Rava says, no, that you could even say that when the person squeezes out the blood and the chilazon is alive, he's still not liable for killing it. Why not? Even though obviously he will kill it in the process. Because with respect to killing it, he's a mitasek. He doesn't intend for that. He just wants to extract the blood. He doesn't want to kill it. So now the Gemara says, wait a second here. But there's a general principle. A general principle that we repeat in Shas again and again, that Moder, Rabbi Shimon, B'Psik Reshe, V'lo Yamut, that we have a general principle that Davar Sheino Mitkaven might be permitted. In other words, it might be permitted to do something where you don't intend the result, the forbidden result, such as dragging a chair along the road. But when it's Pasik Reshe, when it's inevitable, we hold you responsible. Isn't it inevitable?
I mean, with fish, there's a way actually to squeeze the fish, to squeeze out the eggs, the female
without
fish,
killing it.
and to
But this is the blood. This is the blood, man. You're not going to
But
squeeze.
this is the blood. What? So they could have taken that example instead.
True. What?
Because that is truly something that is practice. That,
Right.
you know,
They don't kill.
squeeze
They don't
out.
kill. But here we're talking about squeezing out the blood. So
But here
for
we're
sure.
squeezing out the blood, which
So inevitably it's going to die. For sure it's going to
Exactly.
die. So the question is, so since it's inevitable, how can we say that because I don't care about that, I'm not responsible for it? So the answer that the Gemara gives is that there's such a concept, even within Pasik Reshe, even within the general concept of inevitable consequences, there are two types. There's the inevitable consequence that is desirable. In other words, if you cut off the head of the chicken because you want your child to play with it and say, I didn't want to kill the chicken, I just want to cut the head off. That's the classic case of Pasik Reshe, right? But still, now you have the chicken. So it's something that's useful. You have the chicken, now you could sell it. Or you could do whatever with the meat of the chicken to a non-Jew, because obviously you didn't do shechita, but you could sell it to a non-Jew. Whereas here, actually, he doesn't want the chilazon to die, because apparently, as long as it's alive, when you squeeze it out and it's alive, Peta would not like this Gemara. When you squeeze out the blood and it's alive, apparently the dye is brighter and clearer. The color of the dye is better when you extract it alive than when you extract it dead. I guess it starts to decay, or its quality starts to go down as soon as the animal dies. So therefore, you really don't want it to die. You want it to stay alive as long as possible. So since it's what's called pasik reshe de la nichale, that it is an inevitable consequence that is undesirable, you're not held responsible for it. Mideoraita. Derabanan, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. But deoraita, you would be. So that's why they say here that you would not be chayav, you would not be held responsible for a separate chatat for the killing of the animal, even though you would be definitely held responsible for catching it, and possibly held responsible, according to Rabbi Yehuda, also for extracting the blood. So now the next malacha on the list was vashochato, somebody who slaughters, because we said atzad tziviv, first you caught the deer, and then you slaughtered it. Shochet mishum mai chayav. So the Gemara asks, why are you chayav? Why are you responsible? What's the malacha in shochet, in slaughtering an animal? So Rashi explains what he means is shechita b'melechet hamishkan hecha. Where do you find in melechet hamishkan, in the making of the mishkan, any sign that they did shechita in the construction of the mishkan? He says, because umay avite ime orot elim meodamim lama li behu shechita machanikana misaged. Rashi explains that when it comes to, let's say they needed animal skins for the mishkan, but they didn't have to do shechita, they just had to killing the animal for sure they had to do. Well, why does the Gemara specify shechita? Why does it specify kosher slaughter? Killing the animal for sure.
you don't have to slaughter in a kosher way.
It wouldn't have to be a kosher slaughter to take the leather.
Take the leather.
Wouldn't have to be, yeah. So Rav Amar Mishum Tzovea. Rav says the reason why shochet is a separate melacha, is separately identified as a melacha, is because the coloring of the skin. In other words, when you slaughter an animal from the neck, the blood that comes out dyes the part of the skin. We're going to see why that's significant in a second. Shmuel Amar Mishum Nitilat Neshama. Shmuel says actually hashochato is lav davka. It's not necessarily specifically shechita. It's just the form that the Mishnah specifies of killing the animal. In other words, any type of killing an animal is prohibited. It just uses hashochato as the example, because that's the classic example. But really, it's not that there's more. In other words, Rav is saying that there's something more to shechita. That you're not only slaughtering the animal and killing it, but you're also dyeing the hide of the animal in the front. So, mishum tovei in mishum tilat neshamala, would you think that Rav thinks that killing the animal is not a malacha, only dyeing the hide of the animal is a malacha? No. Ema af mishum tovei. What he meant was, even, in other words, the reason why he meant it to shochato is because there's two elements in shechita. There's the killing of the animal, which for sure you're not allowed to do, and then, which was done for the mishkan, so for sure it's a malacha. And slaughtering in particular has the effect of dyeing the neck of the animal with the blood. So we're going to see why that's significant. Amar Rav says, Milta da Amri. The thing that I said, Ema ba Milta, I want to say something about it. Delo letud dare batrai belichachu alai. I don't want the next generations to come and make fun of me. In other words, it sounds stupid that I'm saying that, it sounds silly that I'm saying that the reason why shechita is a problem is because it dyes the front of the hide. What does that mean? B'may nichale. So ve'ah b'may nichale. What is the purpose of dyeing the neck of the animal? Because nicha de litvas bet shechita dama, it's useful to have a blood-stained neck of the animal, because ki'echid lehazua inashe v'leitu v'lizbenu minei, because when they see that hide, they would hang up that hide with the blood on it, and people would say, oh, there's fresh meat to be bought. He just slaughtered an animal. And they would come and buy it. So he says that's the reason why shechita has a dual function. It dyes the front of the hide, which is a benefit in its own right, in addition to slaughtering of the animal. So now the Gemara says, when you take the skin, salting the skin, and tanning the hide, these are two melachot. So the Gemara says, these are actually two of the same thing, because part of the process of tanning the hide is salting it. So why are these separated into two different melachot? Really, they're both the same process. They would put a lot of salt on the hide as part of the process of tanning it, apparently. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish Taimei Tarvayu, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish said together, Apik chad minayu, remove one of these, ve'ayel sirtut, rather than moleach and me'abed. Moleach is not its own melacha. Salting is not its own melacha. That's just part of the process of tanning. And what melacha should really be included in the Mishnah is sirtut, etching lines into the skin. So there are two reasons why you would do that. One is if you wanted to cut, like Rashi says, if you wanted to cut pieces of skin, instead of drawing on it, they would etch into it lines that they would know where to cut. The Rambam says it's talking about the etching of that you see in parchment, in cloth, that they would etch lines like in a mezuzah or in a tefillin or in Sefer Torah, that they would put they would etch lines in. Actually, it's not in tefillin, but that's another story. That they would etch lines in order to write straight. Okay, so these lines were part of the process of writing. So they're not themselves writing; they're just etched, indents in the parchment. So that's what should be there. Sirtut. Amar Rabba bar Ravuna said, "Hi man demalach bisra chayav mishum me'abed." A person who heavily salts meat is culpable because of me'abed. It's like tanning. It's like you tan the meat. Rava says, "Ein ibud ba'ochelin." There's no such thing as ibud, as tanning when it comes to food. Tanning is only something that's done to skins. So even if you salted meat, it would not be considered tanning. Amar Ravashe says, "Vafilo Rabba bar Ravuna lo amar ela dekaba ile lo orcha, aval lebeta lo mishave enesh michle etz." He said, even Rabba bar Ravuna, who said that salting meat is a problem, is only talking about the heavy salting of meat that you would take with you on a long journey. But salting your meat at the table, putting a little salt on your steak, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about because he says a person doesn't make their food into a wood. He doesn't want it to harden to the point of being inedible. If you're going on a very, very long trip and you need to preserve it for a long trip, that's one story. Then Rabbi Bar Ravuna would say that that's just like salting a piece of leather to tan it. But just salting food at the level of edibility is not an issue, according to anybody. So we're still on the topic of skin. Smoothing the skin and cutting the skin to size. These are two melachot. Amar Rabbi Acha bar Hanina. Rabbi Acha bar Hanina said, "Hashaf ben amudim b'Shabbat chayav mishum memachek." That somebody who smooths between the pillars on Shabbat is culpable because of mimachek, because of smoothing. Now what Rashi says this means is that they would have these various kinds of pillars set up in different formations, and in between the pillars would be spaces where you could stand or sit. And it's talking about smoothing out the ground in between these pillars. That's what Rashi says. Some say it means smoothing the pillars themselves. And some say it means taking a piece of leather and smoothing it against the pillar. Okay, so there are three different interpretations of what this means. The problem with Rashi, who says that it means smoothing the ground between the pillars, is that should be a different melacha. That should be like the melacha of choresh, because it's preparing the ground. It's smoothing the ground. Okay? But in any case, all of these cases would not be allowed anyhow. Amar Rabbi Chaya bar Abba says, Shlosha dvarim sachli Rav Ashe mishmei de Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. There were three things that Rav Ashe told me in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Hamigarer Rashe klunasot b'Shabbat. That a person who smooths out the top of pillars on Shabbat, chayav. Mishu mechatech. In other words, they would have, let's say, pieces of certain types of sticks that they would want to make the tops of them smooth and flat and even. So they would, let's say, shave off a little bit on the top to make them all smooth and flat and even. So that's a malacha of mechatech, because he is cutting it to a certain size. And if you had a bandage that was on your with some kind of a thick cream on Shabbat, and you wanted to smooth it out over your arm, some kind of a paste that they would put on the arm, that would also be chayav mishum memachek. That's smoothing out, and that would be a problem. And somebody who I don't know what the word is in English when you chisel. Yeah, well, I guess chisel is the right word. Yeah, when you chisel a stone to smooth it out, when you smooth out the stone. Yeah, when you smooth out a stone is a malacha of makeba patish, the final hammer blow. Makeba patish means anytime you perfect something, you bring it to its final state. Actually, Tosafot says hamisatet could even mean engraving in stone, some kind of design. Rashi says it just means smoothing out the stone. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Kisma said that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, Hatzar tzura b'kili, a person who makes a design in a kli, in a vessel, and somebody who blows glass to make a shape, chayav mishum makeba patish. This is an example of makeba patish also, because you're putting the final touches, the finishing touches on an object. Amar Rabbi Yehuda said, a person who takes, let's say you get a new garment, and in the new garment there are certain threads that are sticking out, and you pull them out. You know, those extra threads that are sticking out of the garment when you buy a new shirt or something like that, or a new suit, and you pull them out. That's makeba patish. You're perfecting it. Or if you, Rashi says, when they sewed your garment, you know, there are little pieces of extraneous material there, maybe a little chip of wood or whatever got caught in the stitch. So you pull it out. So he says that's makeba patish, you're completing the garment. But that's only if you didn't like it. In other words, you were makpid. You didn't want that. If you don't really care, so then pulling it out is no issue. You would have gone out with it anyway. But if you care about it and you won't wear it until it's in the proper state, so then it's a good thing.
Like freeze-dried coffee, and it's really cooked. It's been freeze-dried. Then it maybe, I don't know if it's makeba, but people are knowing to use it.
Right, sure. Well, it's not a kli. Makeba patish is talking about where you have like a vessel. Where you have a vessel. For a bishul is a different thing. Yeah, that's
makeba patish.
It doesn't really apply to foods. It wouldn't apply to foods. So that's why that wouldn't come up. But I hear what you're saying, though. And here you have two letters. Writing two letters is a malacha. If you wrote one huge letter, let's say you wrote a huge A, letter A, big letter A, even though it's big enough that you could put two letters in that space, still it's only one letter. You're not going to have to bring a korban for that. But let's say you erase that letter. But let's say you erase that big letter, and now there's space enough to write two letters. Because what is the definition of the milacha of erasing? Erasing to create a space to write. And the measurement is the same as the measurement of writing. So writing just one letter is not enough. But creating a space where two letters can be written is enough. Even though all you did was erase one letter, you erased one really big letter. Amar Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yosei. Rabbi Menachem, the son of Rabbi Yosei, said, this is a stringency with regard to erasing that's greater than writing itself. Because in writing you actually have to write two letters. In erasing, if you erase a big letter where you could fit two, actually you did the malacha with erasing less than you would have to do for writing, because you only erased one letter, but effectively you created a surface worthy of two letters.
Even if you erased something because it was you didn't want to write in a space.
No, it's only if you wanted to write. No, it's only if you
want to write in a space.
That's the one, right? So that lists several of them. Haboneh, the one who builds. V'hasoter, and the one who destroys. Hamchabed, the one who extinguishes. V'hamavir, and the one who lights a fire. V'hamakeh b'patish, and the one who strikes the final hammer blow. Rabban Rabbi Zera both said, Kol midei de'itbe gemar melacha. We already kind of inferred this principle, but now they explicitly say it. That anything which is the gemar melacha, which is the completion of the melacha, the completion of the fashioning of an item, that is chayav mishum makeh b'patish. That is what you're going to be culpable for. The final hammer blow is defined as the finishing touch is put on something that has been created. Elu avot melachot, the Mishnah ended by saying these are the granddaddy, these are the principal melachot that are prohibited on Shabbat. So why does it have to say that? Elu lapukeh mid Rabbi Eliezer. So why do we have to say elu, that these are the melachot? What does that mean? What's it limiting? That is to exclude the statement of Rabbi Eliezer, "Demechayev al tolada b'makom av," because we've distinguished many times between avot melachot and toladot. Avot are the principal ones, and a tolada is a derivative melacha. And the general principle of the Chachamim is that these principal melachot, if you were to do a principal melacha and one of its derivatives together, it would not be two separate liabilities, but only one. So that's why the 39 melachot are important, because if you do two different avot, it's two different liabilities. If you do two different toladot of two different avot, it's also two different liabilities. But if you did an av and its tolada, then it's going to be subsumed under the same liability. That's why it's important to have the structure of 39 melachot. But Rabbi Eliezer says no, he's mechayev al tolada b'makom av. He says even if you did an av melacha with its own derivative melacha, you're still culpable for both. And there's a discussion. Huh?
You're talking about
Be'elem echad, right? Yes, if you forgot. In other words, you forgot that both of them were prohibited. Yeah. Because that's the only time. If you forgot about Shabbat,
Tolada, you're chayav. In other words, you did one tolada period.
Right, of course, it's the same.
Right,
it's just that you can consolidate if you did the av and the tolada.
And the tolada, you only chayav one.
Yeah, and there's a discussion elsewhere in Shas. This is brought up. So then, what's the point of having avot melachot according to Rabbi Eliezer? So he has to explain. He has to account for that problem. I believe it's in the beginning of Bava Kama. It's brought up. Why does Rabbi Eliezer have avot and toladot if he doesn't think that they make a difference anyway? And he says that it's in order to connect it back to the Mishkan, basically, to have avot to remind us the link back to the Mishkan. So those melachot that were in the Mishkan are counted as the avot, even though really avot and toladot are all the same halachically according to Rabbi Eliezer. So our Mishnah, by mentioning elu avot melachot, is telling you that they're not all the same according to the Chachamim. That actually avot are seen as more primary, and that's why if you did a tolada with an av, they would be subsumed under one liability. Chaser achat, it also says at the end that these are the 40 minus 1 melachot, arba'im chaser achat. So why does it say that? Lapukei mid Rabbi Yehuda. This is to exclude Rabbi Yehuda because Rabbi Yehuda had 41 melachot. He didn't have the 39. The Tanya, as we learned in the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda mosif et hashovet v'amedaktek. Rabbi Yehuda added 2 stages in the weaving process that were not included in the Mishnah. One is hashovet, and the other one is hamedaktek. So Rashi explains what this is. Shovet means that when you would put, there were 2 stages. You would put the stationary strings across the loom, right, the warp, and then you would have the moving string. So the stationary strings, he says, hashovet means when you would hit those in order to straighten them out and make sure that they were even. Hamedakdek was when you brought the string that actually goes across, the moving string. When you would bring that you would hit it also to make sure that it wasn't too tight. Because if it were too tight, that was a way to loosen it, to pull more string, basically by hitting it. Because if you left it too tight, then it wouldn't mesh with the rest of the fabric properly. It would stick out, basically, if it were too tight. Yeah. So to make it uniform. So these 2 steps, straightening, and we already know that making the loom, in other words, setting up the loom, is already a melacha. He's saying also making them parallel, straightening them, is another melacha. And we know that obviously putting the horizontal across the stationary is definitely a malacha, that's actually weaving. But even that he's saying that there's another av malacha, which is beating it afterwards to loosen it so that it doesn't get too tight. Okay, so he's adding 2 malachot to that. Amrullah, they said to him, Shovet harehu b'chlal mesech, that's not really a separate melacha, because shovet, because when you make sure that the stationary strings are parallel, that's just part of setting them up. That's not a separate melacha. And moreover, medakdek arihu b'chlal oreg, and beating the horizontal string to make sure that it's not too tight is just part of weaving. It's not a separate melacha to do that, but it's just part of the weaving process. And therefore, the rabbis do not count that as two separate melachot, but rather the Rambam counts it as toladot of those respective melachot. That says basically they are subsumed under them because they're part of the process of doing those things. Now we come to the new Mishnah. The new Mishnah says, Va'od klal acher amru. So we already had klal gadol at the beginning of the Masechet, which was the big principle. Now we have another principle, and we're getting back to the subject of carrying again. So we've taken a respite from it, and now we're back. What's the new principle? Kol hakasher latzniya u'matznin kamohu v'otzio b'shabbat chayav chatat alav. So we have a question, which is, how much do you have to transport from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim? Most melachot have a minimum measurement, a shi'ur. So what is the measurement of how much? What if I have a tiny piece of lint that I accidentally, does that count? Well, where is the minimum amount that makes it significant? So the answer is, anything which is kasher latzniya, which is worthy of being saved, and matzni'in kamahu, and it's something that people typically save, an amount that people will typically preserve for a purpose in their house. It's a worthwhile, it's valuable. Okay, it has to be a valuable quantity, and you brought it out on Shabbat, you're chayav chatat. V'kol she'eino kasher latzniya, and anything which is not fit to be saved. In other words, it's something which is not the type of thing that a person ever saves. Ve'en matznin kamahu, and it's not the amount of, and it's not the quantity. In other words, it's talking about quality and quantity. It's of a quality that people don't save, and it's of a quantity that people wouldn't save. So even if it were something that you would save, but it's like a tiny amount of peanut butter, this amount, no, people will throw that out. They're not going to save it. So quantitatively, it can be insufficient. So then the only person who would be culpable for that would be someone who kept it. In other words, let's say you're a pack rat, and every barley corn you save. Most people, they won't do that, but you do. So therefore, if you brought out one barley corn because you would save it, you would be chayav. But a normal person, let's say an average person, who carried that out would not be. Because it's not enough. It's not the amount that a person would typically save. So the Gemara says, what do you mean when you say anything which is worthy of saving? In other words, you're obviously trying to exclude something that would qualitatively, on a qualitative basis, be something that nobody would save. So what did you have in mind? Rav Papa Amar Lapuke Dam Nida. Rav Papa says it means menstrual blood. Nobody saves blood. Who wants that around? Mar Ukva Amar Lapuke Atze Ashera. Mar Ukva says it means Atze Ashera, the wood of an Ashera, of an idolatrous tree, because you're not allowed to save it. It's got to be destroyed. So by definition, intrinsically, in other words, the first example is aesthetically, you don't want blood, menstrual blood. The other one is halachically, it needs to be destroyed. It's Atzei Asherah. So, Manda Amar Dam Nida Koshken Atzei Asherah. Now, certainly the person who says that menstrual blood is of a quality that you wouldn't keep it around is going to agree that idolatrous tree wood is going to be something that you wouldn't keep around, because if he's going to apply the principle to something that's aesthetically objectionable, then certainly he's going to apply the principle to something that's objectively, halachically objectionable. However, Mandamar Atzei Ashira Aval Dam Nida Matznale, the Shunra. But the one that says that Atzei Ashira, that the wood from an idolatrous tree is the definition, is the example of a thing that one would not keep around. That's because he looks at it only objectively, halachically. Something that needs to be destroyed from a halachic standpoint is what we're looking at. But something that personally is objectionable, that's too subjective. And he says some people might save the blood to feed to a cat. Apparently they used to feed blood to cats. I never heard that before, but I guess so. Ve'idach. So why is it that Rav Papa says that keeping blood around would be abnormal if it's fed to cats? He said because apparently another thing that we didn't know was that if you feed menstrual blood to a cat, it will make the person whose blood is fed to the cat weaker because the cat consumed it. So they don't really keep it around. So, but in any case, they argue. In other words, Mar Ukva is saying there's nothing really qualitatively that we could point to and say nobody would save this. We can only look at it in halachic terms and say that Atzei Asherah, which are halachically mandated to be destroyed, that nobody's going to keep. Whereas Rav Papa is saying that there are certain things that aesthetically are so objectionable that a person is not going to keep them around either, and therefore from a qualitative standpoint, they would be you would be patur if you carried them out. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina said, "Hi, deloke Rabbi Shimon." This Mishnah is not following Rabbi Shimon. The Ikar Rabbi Shimon, because if it were to follow Rabbi Shimon, Amar lo amru kol shirin halalu el matzniehen, because Rabbi Shimon said that all of the shiurin, all of the measurements. You see, our Mishnah says that if you carry something out that meets the minimum measurement of an average person, you are chayav for carrying on Shabbat, even if you personally wouldn't have kept it. Let's say you're so wealthy that you wouldn't have kept this amount, but an average person would. Rabbi Shimon says that for you, it's not significant. But our Mishnah is saying if it's objectively significant to the average person, the quantity, so then you would be obligated even if you personally wouldn't keep it. And if you personally would keep it, then for you, it's a significant amount. Rabbi Shimon is saying that the minimum amounts are an objective standard, but only for the average person, not for a person who would.
Papa would say that Isuri Hana'ah, you're allowed to. I mean, it's not a Isur Chatat.
No, right. Everybody agrees. Everybody agrees about that.
But you can take out.
He wouldn't say you could, but he would say you're not chayav. Maybe it's only D'Rabbanan, because it's something that, is Asur B'Hana'an, has to be destroyed. Yeah, so Amar Rabbi Elazar says, we're turning to just the beginning of Amud, of Ayin Vav Amud Aleph, so we could start with the new Mishnah tomorrow. Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Had Loka Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, our Mishnah that said, V'kol she'eno kasher latzniya. Our Mishnah said that anything which is not, from a qualitative standpoint, would not be kept, or ein matznin kamohu, or quantitatively wouldn't be kept, is therefore not significant. This is not what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says. Ditani, as we said in the Braita, Kalal am Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said a general principle: Kol she'eno kasher latzniya, ve'en matznin kamohu, ve'huchshar lazeh v'tznio u'ba'acher v'otzio nitchayev zeh b'machashava shel zeh. So he had a very interesting position. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar agrees that subjectively you can make something significant, but our Mishnah said only for you. Let's say that Matyas keeps tiny feathers. He likes tiny feathers. Most people, they don't like tiny feathers, so throw it away. But Matyas, he keeps it. So the average person would only keep a significant amount of feather that could be useful. But Matyas, he keeps it. So our Mishnah would say, if Matyas carries it out because it's for him significant, chayav. If I carry it out because it's not significant for me, it wouldn't be chayav. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar comes around with a new idea. He says, if somebody saved this item, they give it significance. They give the object significance. So since this is part of Matyas's collection of feathers that he saved, and he rendered it significant, now even if I carry it out, I'm going to be culpable. Our Mishnah said it's only the individual who has that attachment to it who's culpable. But us, the average people, we wouldn't be. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says once the person qualifies it as significant, it's now significant for everybody.
What if it's
because it's part of their collection.
What if it's a Jew in Malaysia who keeps, pieces of dung?
Right. That's what he's saying. He's saying anything that person.
But that's only specific.
No. Only that one. Yeah, not anyone in the world.
Not any feather.
Right. It doesn't mean anyone in the world. It doesn't mean because Matyas keeps dung, therefore everyone's dung in the world. It's saying only yours.
Right. It's your collection.
In other words, once you made a collection, that collection becomes significant. Yeah. Only that one.
That's specific collection.
Like I come to your house and you say, "Could you carry this tiny feather for me?" And I'm like, okay, I guess so because it's nothing. For the object. You made Matyas's collection, you made it important to you. So because it was important to you, it's like ach sheveh. You rendered it significant.
If it's not important to you, if you carry it, that's...
Because you made it important.
Right.
You made it important.
For instance, in his own house, where that feather means nothing to him.
I'd be able to... It wouldn't be anything. Exactly.